You are listening to www.integralnaked.org.
Hello, Alanis.
Hi, Ken. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
So, what have you been up to?
I just got back from Big Sur.
Yeah?
One of my favorite places on the planet. So.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Have you spent a lot of time there? Or?
Not a lot of time, but I've been there. Of course, Esalen Institute is located there, and Mike Murphy's a really good friend of mine.
Mm.
And Esalen is kind of, sort of one of the spearheads of letting Eastern traditions into this country, and also the human potential movement, basically, was birthed there.
Yeah.
So what part of Big Sur were you in? Were you at Esalen?
I went to do just room and board at Esalen, which I do often, but I guess they'd had a workshop there this weekend, and they were pretty full up, so I stayed at Post Ranch. I often just go because Big Sur itself is such a calling to me.
In what way? Just the whole feel of it? Because an extraordinary kind of vibration to the place.
The vibration, the aesthetic of it. In Northern California, really, there's a consciousness in that area of the planet that just has a really great vibration that I connect with. And then the history of it, too. Henry Miller and Anais Nin and Jack Kerouac spent time there, so there's the whole writer vibration that's there, too. And then I'm a hippie at heart. So that helps.
Yeah, Mike Murphy is really an extraordinary guy and one of my best friends, both personally and theoretically. And he's really sort of pioneered the integral approach to spiritual development.
Oh, great.
And in part he got it from Aurobindo, when he spent a lot of time in India and at the Aurobindo ashram, and has written enormously about what integral transformative practice means. And the general essence of that, basically Mike Murphy and George Leonard and myself, I guess, are the ones that have done a lot of work in this area. And the general idea about integral transformative practice is that it's sort of like spiritual cross-training, that if you exercise aspects of the body and aspects of the mind and aspects of spirit, and you do it concurrently, you get faster gains in each of them.
Yeah, big yes to that.
Yeah, right.
And yes.
So that's something that Mike and I have spent a lot of time going over, and what are the sort of the minimum modules you need, and what is the fastest type of gain you can get, and exactly what practices should be done, and so on. That's what's really astonishing about what's happened over the last 30 or 40 years is when that influx all first started in the 60s, basically, we had no idea how it fit together or what it meant or which pieces were really important or which were sort of important. A lot of things came and went in terms of new practices and, revolutionary new paradigms that were going to change everything. But basically over 2 or 3 decades, it's really sort of shaken down into some enduring and really important human potential practices. And of course, there's still hundreds of various types of practices, but fundamentally meditation and fundamentally body work and fundamentally work on shadow issues. And that was a big thing that meditation doesn't cover, shadow work, like a shawl.
Having met a lot of people who are meditators and more kind of on the spiritual side of things, there at times can be the lack of integrating the shadows, and then I'll be in a lot of sort of psychologically minded circles, and I'm often craving that sense of spirit for it to be imbued in the whole, more like the transpersonal psychology, just having both be available is my favorite.
And you would think that would be more popular, wouldn't you? You'd think it would be more common that you would find those two things.
Yeah, you would think. Probably becoming more common now. But still to this day, I find myself in certain herds or tribes or circles where there's one kind of focal point, and I usually glaze over after a while because there's not a multi-tentacled approach to something. I usually need to leave.
Yeah. Yeah, well...
I usually have to go home. Yeah.
That's such an intrinsically integral approach that you have. I'm curious how long you have had that orientation. Do you think that you were kind of born that way, or do you think you came about it in the course of your own artistic growth and development, this desire to have a comprehensive approach?
I think it was a combination of, I felt like I was a little witch that was unusual, which is unusual in terms of in the environments I was in. It was not something that was welcomed or championed by any means.
Yeah.
Tolerated at best, probably, which was better than nothing.
Yeah.
And then I think my orientation toward wanting to understand the human condition was both born of my love of God and life, but also just born of my ultimately being resistant to my own pain.
Yeah.
So in a good way, I was actually motivated by this perfectionism and this naive concept that at some point, if I do enough inner work and I integrate enough shadows and I understand psychology enough and I can have dialogues and resolve conflict, then one day I will be totally peaceful, inhuman. But I can still be here to enjoy the trees and the birds and the love and the sensual pleasures, but I will have arrived on some level. So that naive thought actually was a propulsion toward all the things that I now approach just for the sheer love and joy of it, more as a process and a journey.
Yeah. Sort of looking over your artistic career, I can see how that would have a major role to play in your own growth in terms of becoming more and more comprehensive and more integral. I think one of the things that stands out in your work, and I think brilliantly, is the way that you have, in a sense, done soul searching, done really deep emotional searching in yourself, and more importantly, really been courageous enough to share it with the audience. And I really think that's an important point, to be able to sort of courageously share your own emotional orientation, your own particular insides, if you will, because that's not something that actually is that common among artists, as strange as that might seem to say at first. Artists are sometimes known for displaying their interiors, but I really don't think many of them do. I think it's more sort of a exterior of the interior. But I think,
or maybe hidden behind a character or a...
Yeah, But I think that your work has really pretty consistently, I think, been noteworthy for going really, really deep and then being willing to share the results of that, good, bad, or ugly. And that's really incredible, actually.
Thank you. I take that in. I think there's a little less courage applied than I may be given credit for, but my goal actually, my aspiration is to apply the courage that it takes to share my personal findings publicly, applying that same courage to my day-to-day interactions. It's a lot easier for me to share with thousands of people what's going on in my life, because there is, although it may not sound like it, there is an impersonal aspect to it.
Yeah. So
taking that and bringing that quality into my interactions with people whom I love is actually 10 times scarier for me.
Yeah.
So it's almost like a Star of Bethlehem. A lot of times I'll write a song and 10 years later I'll hear it as though it's being spoken to me because it's what I need to hear. So,
which is interesting. I mean, it's sort of like your higher self was creating a little bit ahead of the time that the rest of you was able of hearing it.
Exactly.
But audiences have responded to it, I think, and that's what has been so really wonderful about your own career.
Yeah, I feel like I give people the invitation and certainly the permission and as best as I can anyway, the safety to experience the full breadth of humanity.
Right.
It's very colorful, as you know, I'm sure.
Yeah.
As you of all people know.
Yes, and the creative process itself can plug into sort of different depths or heights of the human being, the human soul, the human psyche. And certain aspects of it just sort of goes kind of a little bit superficially, and there's a lot of that kind of creativity out there. But then other aspects of it seem to really plug into a very, very higher self. And that's the thing we were talking about a little bit last time we talked in terms of the creative process itself feeling like almost that you're sort of being inhabited, that there's this extraordinary insight or awareness or force or beauty or grace or intelligence that is forming itself. And sort of your job is to both get out of the way and craft it, basically make sure it gets delivered. Yeah. But it's an extraordinary process.
It's a humbling one. It's using my psyche and my brain as that which siphons this information that's coming through, and it's also my unique take on it. It's like that's what I think is so great about all the different artists out there, whether they're superficial or profound or whatever label I put on them. It's just such a unique version, and speaks to whatever capacity any given artist has for emotionality or otherwise.
Right.
And it's a very humbling experience to the point where the process itself is very quick, but I think we spoke about this briefly too. It's like being hooked up to an IV, like draining everything out in however many minutes. In some cases, a song will be written in about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And then being done, but the lead up to it is a life lived.
And that, in terms of being an artist, sort of the same question. Do you think you were kind of born to do that? Was there time? Do you remember your earliest memories that you wanted to be an artist, or did that come about fairly slowly? I mean, your first album was when you were like 17, I think.
Yeah, I actually wrote my first songs when I was 10, and I had a record label that I put together with a friend of mine when I was 11 because no record companies wanted to sign me, which I think is understandable. A little scared. Although nowadays, God, they'd sign you when you were an embryo.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll table that conversation for another time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I started writing songs when I was 9 and had a record out when I was 11. And that's when the formal songwriting started. But I remember having written poetry, some pretty funny ones, as far back as 6 years old. And it was like a Judy Garland, Shirley MacLaine thing for me. Like, I loved dancing and writing and singing and acting and that whole part, drama.
Right.
I live for drama.
And so,
I mean, not gratuitous drama, but the human drama.
So, in the course of that sort of drama unfolding, when did it start to take something that you would recognize as, let's say, a psychological exploration, and as distinct from a spiritual exploration, although I want to ask that as well. But do you remember when you started to say, wait, I'm not just doing, a dance pop song, or I'm not doing I'm actually looking at some part of myself. I'm actually getting into a really interesting, maybe difficult portion of my own psyche. When did that sort of awareness start to creep into your mind?
I had written songs as a teenager, I'd say 5% of which were psychologically, spiritually, emotionally oriented.
Yeah.
And to be honest, anytime I wrote anything that didn't rhyme, it was frowned upon. And when I'm writing about matters of the heart, I can't always rhyme. It's just not going to happen. Heart and apart, you can only use those words so many times. So basically, when I moved to Los Angeles right around 19 years old, I remember saying to myself that I wouldn't stop the search for the ultimate musical collaborator until I felt the songs truly represented where I was at. And I didn't want to stop until that point. So I think that commitment and that conviction that was the only kind of expression I now wanted to do helped me not only meet Glenn Ballard, whom I wrote Jagged Little Pill with, but also open the door to writing really authentically.
And I think Jagged Little Pill, I mean, other than being a just phenomenal, staggering success, it's not like one or two all-time best-selling albums by female artists in the history of the known universe. I remember the impact that it had on so many people, again, in terms of just the emotional honesty of it, the emotional straightforwardness and sort of truthfulness in it, which was very, very different than the types of songs that were being done at the time. But I was curious, which again is part of what I was saying earlier about part of what I think your genius has been being able to look into yourself and come up with things that can connect with other people. And you also said something last time when we talked I thought was very striking, which was something like your major purpose in life was to connect the human and the divine. And so I want to sort of ask about that as well. But just a second ago you said that you sort of vowed not to give up looking for the perfect collaborator. What part have collaborators played in your art?
I think it's a combination of their being able to hold what I bring forth. So it would mean that their ceiling would have to be as high as mine, if not higher, in whatever area we were exploring creatively.
Right.
And then also for them to bring their own uniqueness to the table, the combination of which, their expression and my expression creates this third entity. And really, that just describes the ultimate collaboration for me.
Well, obviously you did pretty well with Glenn. Do you continue to look for collaborators?
Yes, I just finished an unbelievably incredible experience with a gentleman named Guy Sigsworth, who's based in the UK.
Right.
We just wrote together 23 songs, 13 of which are on my new record, and
the new album,
we finished last week. So.
Yeah, I know. It's just wow. I mean, that's so cool. I mean, congratulations.
Thanks.
It's so great.
Thank you.
So, where did you meet him?
I had received a lot of names from different people who really were invested in my reaching out to different producers,
right.
none of whom I resonated with. So, i.e., I didn't even want to explore it because it just didn't feel right. And I'd heard a frou-frou song called Let Go that Guy wrote with Imogen Heap and produced himself. And I remember hearing that track thinking, this song is a flawlessly produced piece of work.
Wow.
So I phoned him myself directly, and we had a great conversation, and the jury was still out. Neither of us knew whether there'd be any chemistry creatively. And then we talked again on the phone a couple times, and then I flew to London, and we started writing, and within the first hour, I knew that it was great.
Apparently when the right collaborator comes along, it fits together pretty quickly.
It does. It's Glenn. In Glenn's case, Glenn's in my case, I'd been set up on so many what we consider to be blind dates with songwriters, and some of them are just disastrous. Some of them are like, let's just go get some tequila and not worry about this. But in Glenn's case, when I went to his house, within 15 minutes, we had written a song that we both still adore to this day.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And we're recording it just about as quickly.
Yeah, fast.
Which is pretty astonishing.
Yeah, if it's an overly thought out or belabored process, I really, at this point, I feel, I have the luxury of knowing how it is to write something really quickly. So I'm not really that interested if it's a drawn out, arduous process. Right.
So the two of you wrote 23 songs, and 13 of those are on the new album.
Yes.
Is there a title for the album?
Yes, it's called Flavors of Entanglement.
Oh, that's great. That is great.
That's so sweet.
It's sort of all sorts of ideas come to mind with that. It's a very free association term.
Yes.
And so I'll bet the songs are sort of like that, too, very rich and yummy.
They run the gamut.
Yeah. I'm also curious about when a sort of a more overtly spiritual side of you or component of you started to come more to the foreground.
Well, I've always had a little love affair with God going as far back as I can remember, so that would be hard to not have bleed into everything that I do. But it depends. Like, I've had a tendency to be a workaholic in the past, so I find that anytime I'm actively involved in any sort of addiction, first thing to jump out the door is my connection with God. God never jumps out, of course, as you know. But I may try to roll up the window and block it out.
But that tends to be one of the things that you tend to forget, is that connection when you're involved in addictivity. Yeah.
Yes. It's the first thing to go.
Yeah.
Funny how that works. So I can tell when I have, I don't know what term to use, but all my chakra wheels are spinning, all my kids are bonded inside me, I feel integrated, and I can tell, when I'm connected to spirit, it means I tend toward less addictive behavior.
Right. And addictions come in, of course, all types of flavors. Addiction to I mean, the obvious ones, drugs, alcohol, and sex then jumped on the scene a few years ago as being everybody's favorite addiction, being a sex addict, which
it's been a long one for a long time.
Yeah.
Only more freely spoken about now. And
exactly.
then, addiction to work.
Of course. Yes,
and
work.
Attention or addiction to busyness or...
Power, control.
We know nothing of which we speak, but I've heard other people have this issue.
Yes, exactly. That's what I hear, that people have these problems.
Yeah, I read about it somewhere.
Yeah. Well, on the fessing up side on one of the websites, it said that you were basically a control freak, so that would be you consider that was sort of your addiction.
Yep.
Was that quoted more or less correctly? Is that?
Sure. Well, I've done so much shadow work now that you could pretty much throw at any label and I'd say sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
So what kind of shadow work are you doing?
I've been a student of Debbie Ford's for many years now.
Yeah.
And I haven't spent that much time in their community in a while, but just really profound. The updated versions of Jungian work, and so many people have really kind of adapted their take on wholeness and shadow work, and there's so many great teachers out there of it. And it's what it's all about. If my aspiration is to love as well as I possibly can and include myself in that love, and I find that shadow work is directly related to that, because if I see something outside of me that I don't like, and it's stopping me from being able to love not only them but myself. So as best as I can, whomever I meet, if I see something that makes me want to strangle them, if I can just say, well, that's me. Where's that me?
Yeah.
Then that's the simplified kind of version.
Well, and that's sort of the Gestalt notion of projections. It's just really so important that we tend to hate those things, and basically only those things that we hate in ourselves, and project first onto others. And you mentioned, of course, working with an individual who had updated the Gestalt method and was working with that.
Yes.
Have you actually done Gestalt work, or is it just part of this overall interest and work that you've done sort of generally?
I think I did an updated version of it. I don't know if we'd have to talk about it more for me to get a sense of whether I'm on the same page there, but I've definitely explored it and loved it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really very, very powerful, and I actually created something called a 3-2-1 process, which is, it wasn't done specifically to summarize what Gestalt does. It was developed for theoretical reasons, and then it was turned into a practical exercise. But it turns out to be a lot of what Gestalt does when working with projections. The 3-2-1 is basically, it reverses the direction that we start repression and projections from. So the original direction that dissociation goes is from a first person to a second person to a third person. So first person is I, so I am angry, or I have anger. And then I push that away, and when I push that away, eventually into a third person. And then it's not, I'm not angry, that person is angry. Or I don't have sexual impulses, that person has sexual impulses. And so the first person stuff that is actually ours looks like, in the shadow form, it belongs to a third person. It belongs to somebody out there. It's not me. And so the 3-2-1 process reverses that.
Wow.
It says take whatever, either dream image if you're working with dreams, or maybe at the end of the day, whatever person sort of most upset you or most attracted you. It can be positive things as well. And then actually identify the person. So make that third person a second person. You put it then in a chair in front of you in your imagination, or you can actually do it. It's the empty chair in Gestalt therapy. And you then start a dialogue with that person. And then you switch positions, and you become that person, so that you're re-owning that which you disowned. And it's a very sort of powerful technique to get us back in touch with our projections and with those aspects of ourselves that we have disowned. And
exciting, God.
It is. It's fun. And so,
and especially the light shadows, too.
That's extremely important, because people project the good stuff as often or more often than the bad stuff.
Yeah, being in the public eye, I'm on the receiving end of a lot of light projection, a lot.
Exactly, and I know what that's like too.
Yeah, you would.
Yeah, I often say I'm not half the saint my fans think, and not half the sinner my critics think.
Nice.
That works for you too, right?
Yeah, definitely. Although, my biggest stretch would be to say I am everything they think I am.
That's very big mind.
We're not there yet. We're getting there, though. We're getting closer every day.
The stuff that you've done, of the Gestalt and Betty Ford, the stuff at Esalen, has that also been something that you picked up rather early? That's probably not something that you were doing at 6, but something that you sort of got an interest in psychological work, that kind of work in your adolescence, late adolescence?
Yeah, I was just trying to I was trying to heal my family with my psychic powers at 4 years old. It was more clairsentient stuff when I was little. But I think in terms of psychology, which also just, for me, it's hard for me to separate the two.
Yeah.
For a long time, I really actively tried to separate psychology and spirituality, and I just could never do it because
it doesn't work.
The more I would do my inner work, the more closely connected to all that is I was, and so I stopped trying to separate them.
Yeah.
That's why I love the term transpersonal psychology too, and
right.
And the terms that you use just resonate so much with me because of that. So, but the first book, I was reading the Cinderella Complex and all of these books when I was about 11 years old.
Wow.
Then I read Harville Hendricks's Keeping the Love You Find when I was about 14 or 15.
Wow.
And that book really rocked my socks because it's pretty integrated in that it talks a lot about shadow work and yet takes into account the biological, gender differences.
Right.
So directly speaks to childhood wounds and the developmental stages of growing into a young adult. And so it was really touching on all these different aspects of the human condition while also tipping the hat to spirit throughout it. So that book really kind of rocked my world, and I didn't feel crazy when I read that book.
Yeah.
First time, maybe. So, yeah.
And the psychology and spirit being sort of inseparable dimensions of the human being is something I, of course, fully agree with. And I'm still sort of thinking about whether we see more of that integration going on nowadays or less of that integration nowadays, which is a point we talked about earlier. And I'm still finding I'm going back and forth on it. On the one hand, I think it is getting quite a bit better. And
where do you see it getting better? Like what?
Well, there's things like, not directly, but there are things like wellness psychology that has somehow succeeded into getting into conventional psychological domains. Martin Seligman, for example, who I believe is the president of the American Psychological Association, has done a lot to promote positive psychology and psychology of well-being within the APA. And this is the APA that will not or just begrudgingly acknowledges humanistic and transpersonal psychology. Mm-hmm. So those kinds of things are getting a little bit better. I find that there's an increasing acceptance of my work in terms of a lot of different types of areas and different disciplines that were not as accepting of them 10 years ago. So I think all of that is very good. And the downside is that it's still surprising, it's just shocking how some people apparently don't get the twitch you and I get when they go into a room and somebody is doing just the psychology stuff separated from spirituality, or just the spirituality stuff separated from psychology. Apparently they're immune to that twitch that we get, that integral twitch. And I find that I just still have a hard time wrapping my mind around people that are comfortable being that fragmented in their theoretical stuff and in apparently their personal lives.
It's probably helping them survive in their own mind on some level, because otherwise there might be more of a surrender to it, or at least an openness to it.
Yeah, I think that's right. In a sense, it's almost a transpersonal or integral psychologist would say that it's even a defense mechanism that they're using against seeing the larger truth.
Larger truth can be really scary when we've when we've been taught to hold on to the very things that we think can be exempt from the temporal aspect of life.
Good point. And it's also one of the really difficult things that spirituality has is that the liberal press, and I don't mean to single out liberals here because the conservatives are even worse, but the liberal press really doesn't have any terminology or any understanding of spirituality except basically sort of two broad categories. One is fundamentalist nutcases, and the other is New Age nutcases.
Right. Either way, nutcases.
That's right. There's nutcases. So when an actual, some sort of genuine spirituality comes along, I mean, the liberal press doesn't know what to do with Zen Buddhism, for example, and Jerry Falwell.
Right.
Or Osama bin Laden. I mean, to them, they're all doing that religion thing. And it's just so extraordinary. At the very least, they don't recognize the difference between pre-rational religion and trans-rational religion. And they lump them all together. And that's an extraordinary handicap for getting spirituality out into a broader domain.
Yeah, well, discernment takes a really huge soulful muscle.
It does, doesn't it?
It can be exhausting for people. It's so much easier to one-dimensionalize and keep the fragmentation going. It keeps everything, the status quo, kind of normal, and change can be terrifying for people.
Well, that's also a good point. And I think that it's exactly that. It does take a large discernment muscle. And absent that, keeping the status quo is exactly what tends to happen. And I think that's why it's so hard to get. I mean, the actual terms that the contemplative or the meditative traditions like Zen or even Christian contemplative spirituality or Sufis as opposed to Muslim exoteric religion or Vedanta, any of those that are really core paths of the great liberation, paths of waking up. Those are so different from fundamentalist, mythic, dogmatic religion. And they shouldn't even really be in the same category.
Yeah,
and
that's where words trip us up.
It's crazy.
I know.
It's crazy. And so it's just, I mean...
Yeah. It's the updated versions, too. I mean, when our consciousness grows or, extends, then our natural tendency is to update that which was come to however many hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago. So I think there's a fear to update because it would require dismantling everything else that they're holding on to in their day-to-day life, too.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I think that's why the fundamentalists themselves are afraid to update it because they think that they have a mandate, usually from the founder of the religion, whether it's Jesus Christ or whether it's Muhammad.
Yeah.
And that they have to believe exactly the word of that person or they're, not going to be saved. They're not going to reach liberation or salvation.
Or damnation in hell.
Well, exactly. That's going to be their reward.
I can appreciate some fear around that.
I can. They all have our demons. But that one is so huge and keeping like 3/4 of the world's population trapped.
I know.
In those levels. But I don't even mind in a sense if the press, and by press I just mean conventional society, but if the press had just a different understanding about what those fundamentalist religions are doing and what the contemplative or trans-rational or the paths of great liberation, the paths of consciousness and awareness and waking up, that they had some understanding of what they were doing. But again, absent that, it's just back to what we're talking about, which is fear of change, lack of discernment muscle, and it makes it really, really difficult in even things like conventional psychologies. So that's what's made it so hard for transpersonal psychology to get recognition from the APA, the Standard American Psychological Association, because it has stuff to do with, that God thing.
Yeah, that God word. I remember editing, loosely, and I loosely use the term editing, but helping someone with, reading their book and just before they were handing it in, and their whole book was a certain vernacular and so clear, and I could tell that the word God was just going to freak people out in this book, and I myself recommended that they change the word God to life, and sure enough, when the manuscript was handed in, he was very happy about it because he knew that, that God word freaked people out.
That's exactly right. Your intuition was right on the money, certainly for the way it's perceived out there. And that's I think it's a very wise piece of advice.
And it begs the question, which God, what God?
Yeah.
Whereas other words are a little bit more
Well, yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. There's at least those two major, and it's not only just two. There's a lot, but there's at least those two major different meanings of God. Mm. So changing that to life is actually a good recommendation. Mm. We face this all the time. I mean, all the books that I edit and the stuff that I do with Shambhala and Integral Press, and it's a absolutely constant issue. And I've got to the point where there's just so many different terms that are used.
3 terms. Which ones do you use the most often? Which ones do you feel best about using, given your awareness of whom it is you may be communicating with? And that's my assumption. I don't know if you are aware of who you're communicating with, whether you're writing it for yourself or, are you writing with an awareness of who will be reading and change things accordingly?
Sometimes the terms are even things like transrational and superconscious and pure awareness, direct experience, awakening. Any of those terms have almost no relation to something you're going to find in a fundamentalist orientation.
Right.
In a fundamentalist religion, it's essentially a mythic narrative that you are supposed to believe. And if you believe it and profess belief in that narrative, then you are saved. You reach eternal salvation.
Right.
And if you don't believe that narrative, then eternal damnation, basically.
Right.
Whereas the paths of the Great Liberation are about waking up, and they're not about believing anything. They're about experiencing your true nature, experiencing your real self.
Yay.
And that's very different. So those kinds of terms, even real self, higher self, and true nature, and so on, are things that we find that we use. Although sometimes, though, we're trying to actually sort of poke a stick in, the eye of people that are using the word God. So I did a thing called the 1, 2, 3 of God, which sounds true, which was talking about, again, first person, second person, and third person, the 3 different ways that you can look at spirit, basically. And we chose to go ahead and use instead of saying the 1, 2, 3 of spirit, to say the 1, 2, 3 of God, just because we wanted to get 2 people that are really oriented around that fundamental concept.
Great. That's a great example of using the exact word that will achieve the goal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You are listening to www.intergalactic.org.